Over there.
Oh, in the mask? When you figure that one out, hit me up.
And if bitches are getting killed, that's on them. Everyone out!
Why are you a grinder when there's a severed head in your closet? We are talking Killer Unicorn. No, this is not a fantasy movie. This one is directed by Drew Bolton and is out on June 14th, 2019. Now, it is a slasher movie, but it is a slasher movie made by and for a very specific audience. That of the LGBTQ audience, specifically the kind of the drag queen scene in Brooklyn, New York. So, I will say this before we kind of go any further in this review. So this is going to be a taste thing. It's a very sexually charged movie, and it's not going to be for everyone. Now, if we're talking about kind of like gay representation and stuff, this is one step beyond gay representation, because this really is about the gay scene, and pretty much the entire cast are kind of drag queens, and it goes into some fairly explicit material. When it takes the culminative climax of this movie takes place on the annual enema party. So you get where I'm going here. This is kind of fairly explicit. So a lot of this, if you're going to want to watch this movie, is going to be, are you part of this kind of community? If you're not, are you kind of like bothered by it one way or the other? Or obviously some people are going to be, maybe it's not made for them. So before you kind of watch this movie, you have to decide whether this kind of like subgenre of a subgenre, so to speak, is going to be something you're going to be interested in. But let's talk about the actual film and what it's about. So it plays a lot like I Know What You Did Last Summer. I mean, you could say it's I Know What You Did Last Enema Party, maybe. It's kind of like Halloween with a kind of a LGBTQ twist. There you go. So we have this group of friends, all of whom are kind of drag queens and that kind of thing, and there is a killer in their midst. And there's this guy who's running around in a kind of plastic unicorn mask and a pair of hot pants. It appears to be winter in Brooklyn, so one would imagine that is rather chilly. Anyway, and he is killing off people from this kind of community. Now, why he's doing that, we're going to get a little bit of a kind of a hint later on in the film. But he's obviously this masked guy who's killing people through a variety of different means, and it really focuses on this one guy called Danny, who is our protagonist, who had potentially maybe a run-in with him in the past, although he may not realise that first of all. And yeah, it's a case of this movie playing a lot like this group of kind of friends and trying to kind of like piece together what has happened and ultimately trying to escape this killer. So what works with Killer Unicorn? Obviously this is servicing a very specific audience that maybe hasn't had kind of a film like this before. So obviously if you are a member of that community, then this is definitely going to be a movie that you're going to be interested in, I feel. In regards to it kind of outside of that and more of just a horror film, this movie does have lots of kind of influences from classic era slasher movies. I've mentioned a couple there. I was also reminded me of Maniac. Things like the music score just kind of reminds me of that kind of that 70s kind of like grindhouse feel. But there's a lot of kind of like homages and kind of classic, nods to kind of classic kind of slasher films. So it may be even worth watching if you are just a classic, a slasher fan. But be prepared, obviously, you are watching one for a very kind of specific audience here. The kills themselves are actually, there's quite a lot of them. It's a fairly high body count. And they are a massive variety in regards to some of the kills. Some of the kills are very inventive. Again, I'll have to say to people that a lot of this stuff is sexually tinged. We have a guy who gets an acid enema. So you get where I'm going with this one. So yeah, so it's pretty painful to look at in a lot of ways when you kind of think of some of this stuff. The killer itself, I feel, is treated as a bit of a mystery. We don't really know kind of too much about him and what's kind of going on there, which I think is good in one respect. So you just don't know what's going to happen. But I would have maybe liked to see a little bit of kind of idea about his motivations. Danny, our central character, I think is definitely the most kind of likeable character in the kind of in the actual group. He's really the only one that's kind of painted with any type of pathos and kind of you know, kind of like a fully developed character. We'll kind of get onto that again. But he's really the only one that the movie really sort of focuses on any type of kind of backstory with, and sort of really kind of character building, that sort of stuff. Everyone else is very superficial, and again, we're going to come on to that. There's a reasonable amount of gore here. There is one scene which is kind of a little bit over CGI, but the majority of the scenes here, it's all kind of like practical, you know, practical effects. The movie runs at a good pace. It's kind of, I think it's very well shot, well lit, extremely well scored, and the killer is certainly a unique killer. What doesn't work for me, well, outside of that thing, is just going to be a taste issue. I mean, that is neither here nor there in regards to quality, but judge it for yourself if you think it's going to be something you're going to be interested in. But just be warned, it is fairly explicit. But outside of that, I think that struck me most about this movie, that I would say is maybe a critique, is the characters in this movie, and I include Danny with this, maybe to a slightly lesser degree, is they all seem incredibly vapid and self-centered. All the characters, like nearly all of the characters, it seems so kind of like wrapped up in their own kind of like selfish needs. It makes it really hard to care about any of these characters because they just seem, quite frankly, horrible people. All they seem to care about is doing drugs. When people die, there just seems to be very little kind of like remorse outside of people scared for their own kind of mortality and stuff like that. So it kind of, nearly all of the characters seem very kind of unlikable, very kind of self-centered. So that's the one thing. The acting is fairly bad. Now, having read about this movie from the kind of the press release that the kind of the company sent over, a lot of the people who appear in this movie are not actors. They're actually kind of real life drag performers, which I guess is a kind of a degree of acting. But when acting on a film, I feel some of the performances here are very kind of like shaky. So there's a few examples where you'll just see people like glance at the camera and things like that. They're just very unconfident in front of the camera. So I felt they're just taking, you know, performers out of their traditional wheelhouse, putting them in a different medium, and some of them not faring very well at all. I mean, not everyone is kind of like, you know, quite as bad, but there are a real kind of like breadth and depth in regards to performances. But no one here, I don't think, is particularly kind of, you know, stands out as a particularly great actor. It's just kind of like from pretty okay to pretty fucking awful, to be quite honest. And you know, outside of it, the actual, you know, the kind of the gay kind of element out of it, when you just boil it down, it is more or less just a kind of a rehash of I Know What We Did Last Summer. So overall, obviously, I feel this is going to be a big hit with a certain audience. I feel it's not going to be, you know, of interest to a lot of people, obviously. But there may be a little bit of crossover here for kind of maybe for horror fans who are not interested in the kind of necessarily the you know, the kind of the drag queen scene, but they might just be want a horror film. But you judge for yourself if that's something you're gonna want to watch. Outside of that, I feel it's a watchable horror film with a kind of an interesting kind of antagonist. But I really didn't like the protagonist. This is the problem with this movie for me. But it's certainly bloody, it's certainly violent, it's certainly original and unique. So let's give it that. And you know, I applaud it for kind of maybe making a film for this kind of audience, knowing it's going to be relatively niche. So I will give it props for that. And I do like it when films take a kind of risk and kind of, you know, make a bold choice. So I'll give it a 6 out of 10. So a unique, creative and bold movie, but certainly not for everyone. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.